The wind came before dawn, crawling low across the Texas plains, carrying the dry scent of cedar and dust. It brushed against the broken fence lines of Marin Ranch, whispering through the cracks a house that had forgotten laughter. Luke Marin stood outside with his hat tilted against the rising sun, watching the land the way a man studies an old wound, familiar, unhealed, and still his. The fields that once sang with motion now lay hollow, brittle grass bending under heat. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, and Luke almost answered just to hear another voice. He had been a horse breaker once, back when his hands still believed in gentleness. Now they were hands that built, mended, and buried. His wife, Clara, had loved this land. The way the light turned gold before storms, the smell of rain before it fell. 2 years since she'd gone, and her ghost still lingered in small things. A cup left on the porch rail, a saddle she cleaned till it shone. Luke hadn't touched that saddle since the day they lowered her into the red earth behind the barn. He spoke to her sometimes when no one was near, just low murmurs carried off by the wind. The ranch had shrunk since then, piece by piece, sold to pay debts. He stayed for no reason he could name, except that leaving felt like admitting she was truly gone. Most days began the same. Silence, chores, then whiskey to dull the ache that followed him like a shadow. But this morning, something broke that rhythm. His phone rang. Cal from a neighboring ranch, voice thin with panic. A wild stallion had torn through their southern fence, scattering the herd. They said it was Blaze, the black devil no one could touch. Luke had heard of him, same as everyone around. A wild Mustang, half legend, half curse. Some swore he'd trampled a man last spring. Others said no one could ride him because he belonged to nothing human. Luke saddled his horse anyway. He told himself it was duty, but there was something restless in his chest. Something that felt like the old Luke stirring again. By the time he reached the ridge, the sky had turned the color of ash. The wind carried the sharp tang of sweat and iron. He spotted Blaze near the corral, dark as stormlight, muscles coiled beneath a skin that shimmered with fury. The stallion stood still until Luke dismounted, then lowered his head, nostrils flaring. It was a standoff. One man, one creature that wanted no master. Luke spoke softly, as he once had to frighten colts. "Easy, boy," he said, voice a rasp. But the horse's ears flicked back, eyes flashing white. The ground trembled when he reared, hooves slicing the air. Luke moved instinctively, ropes swinging, boots scraping the dust. He almost had him, until Blaze lunged. The force knocked him hard into the fence, pain exploding through his ribs. He hit the dirt, breath stolen clean from his lungs. The world blurred to light and motion. He heard the thunder of hooves, felt the grit of earth in his mouth. Somewhere inside the chaos, something warm trickled down his side. Blood, maybe. He tried to move, but his arm wouldn't obey. Above him, the stallion pawed the ground, chest heaving. A creature made a wildfire in terror. And then silence. The horse's shadow loomed, trembling, before it turned and vanished into the trees. Luke lay still, dust settling like snow over him. The sky above it opened into that hard Texas blue, endless and cold. He thought of Clara's voice then, her laughter rising to memory like water through stone. He wanted to tell her he'd tried, that he was still trying. Just before the darkness claimed him, he heard something new. Footsteps rushing through the brush, a woman's voice calling his name. He didn't know her, but there was something steady in that sound, something alive enough to pull him back for one more breath. Then the world went quiet again. The first thing Luke noticed when he woke was the smell, sage and smoke, faintly sweet, like rain on dust. The ceiling above him was low, paneled with old pine. His ribs ached with each breath, and when he tried to sit up, pain flared white behind his eyes. A gentle voice stopped him before he could move again. "Don't," it said. "You'll tear the stitches." He turned his head and saw her. A woman sat beside the bed, sleeves rolled her elbows, dark hair tied loosely at her neck. She had a quiet steadiness about her, as if she'd learned long ago not to waste words on panic. "You're lucky I found you when I did," she said. "That horse would have finished the job." Luke tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. "Where?" "My place," she answered simply. half a mile from your fence line. You've been out for 2 days. She poured water into a tin cup and held it to his lips. Her hands were small, but certain, the hands of someone used to working with pain. When he finally managed to drink, he asked her name. Marisol Vega, she said. My father used to work for your family years ago. I came back after he passed. Started tending horses, patching up strays. She looked toward the window where sunlight pooled across the wooden floor. Found you lying next to one. Luke remembered fragments. The black stallion, the ground rising up, the rush of hooves. Blaze, he said, wincing. Did he? He's alive, she said before he could finish. Shaken, cut up pretty bad. I've got him in my paddock for now. He let out a breath, part relief, part confusion. You're keeping him? For now, she said again, meeting his eyes. Until he learns not every hand means harm. Her words hit deeper than he expected. Luke looked away, noticing the bandages around his ribs, the smell of medicine and earth. You shouldn't be bothered, he muttered. Wasn't your fight. She smiled faintly, not unkindly. Maybe not, but I've seen too many things die because folks decided it wasn't their fight. The silence that followed was gentle, not awkward. Outside, a windmill creaked. A horse snorted somewhere in the distance. The sound soft but steady. Marisol rose, checking a pot simmering on the stove. The rhythm of her movement was calm, practiced. She wasn't someone who filled space with noise. She let quiet do the talking. That night, Luke couldn't sleep. The ache in his side kept him still, but his thoughts moved restlessly. The woman in the next room hummed an old tune, low and steady, and he found himself listening. There was something familiar in the melody, something that reminded him of Clara's humming when she brushed her mare at dusk. He closed his eyes and let the sound carry him somewhere gentler. By morning, he was strong enough to stand. He limped to the doorway, steadying himself against the frame. Outside, the light had turned silver. Marisol was near the corral, brushing the wild horse's flank. Blaze flinched but didn't rear. His muscles twitched under her touch, yet he stayed. The sight rooted Luke where he stood. You should rest, she said without turning. Can't, he replied. Too much waiting to be done. Then do it slow, she said. That's the only kind that lasts. He didn't answer, but when she handed him the brush, he didn't refuse. Together, they stood by the stallion, man, woman, and beast, each scarred in their own way, each pretending not to need the other. The air smelled of hay and sunlight, and for the first time in years, Luke felt something shift inside him, small and uncertain, but alive. When Blaze lowered his head, just enough to let the brush pass down his neck, Marisol's voice softened. He'll heal, she whispered. If you let him. Luke met her gaze, steady and unflinching. We'll see, he said, though part of him already knew. The real healing had just begun. Days passed like wind over tall grass. Quiet, constant, reshaping everything without anyone noticing. Luke healed slow, the ache in his ribs easing each morning, though something deeper began to stir that had nothing to do with bone. He rose early, helping Marisol mend fences, clean tack, and fetch water from the creek. They spoke little, but silence between them had softened. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of people learning the same language in different ways. Blaze watched him from the paddock, eyes sharp, every muscle alert. His leg wound had closed into a pale line, though trust took longer to mend. Luke would stand by the fence each afternoon, hat in hand, letting the horse decide the distance. You don't rush something wild, Marisol would remind him. You let it choose the moment. He'd nod, though patience had never come easy to him. Some evenings, when the sun lowered and shadows stretched long across the pasture, Luke read from Marisol's father's old journal. The pages were worn, corners darkened with sweat and years. Notes filled every margin, sketches of bridles, scribbled lines about gentleness, about the weight of fear in a creature's eyes. One line struck him more than the rest. You can't break what's already broken. You can only teach it to live again. Luke closed the book and stared toward the paddock until dusk swallowed the light. The next morning brought thunder. A storm rolled in from the west. The sky split with flashes that made Blaze pace the corral. The wind carried the electric scent of rain and panic. Marisol was inside, tending the fire, when Luke saw the gate shutter. Before he could reach it, the horse burst free, galloping into the open field like a shadow come alive. He followed without thinking, pain stabbing his ribs as he ran. Rain came in sheets, stinging his face, turning the ground to slick mud. He caught sight of Blaze near the creek bed, entangled in old barbed wire half buried under brush. The stallion thrashed, blood streaking his flank. Luke slowed his steps, breath ragged, voice low. "Easy now," he murmured. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you." He approached like one might approach a ghost. The horse trembled but didn't strike. With careful movements, Luke untangled the wire, every slice of metal cutting his hands raw. The rain drowned his curses, washed the blood into the earth. When the last strand fell away, Blaze stood motionless, chest heaving. Luke reached out, waiting for ejection, but instead, the stallion's head lowered, muzzle brushing his shoulder like an unspoken truce. For a long heartbeat, man and beast stood in the downpour, both shivering, both free. By the time they returned, Marisol met them with a blanket and disbelief. "You're soaked through," she said, scolding more than shouting. Her hands shook as she wiped mud from his face. He caught her wrist gently. "He let me," he said, voice barely above the rain. "Didn't fight. Just let me." Something in her eyes shifted then, soft pride, quiet awe. That night, the storm passed, leaving the world silver and clean. They sat on the porch wrapped in separate blankets, steam rising from mugs of coffee. Blaze rested near the fence, head bowed, calm as dusk. The silence between them felt different now, full instead of empty. Marisol looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You keep trying to fix things that don't need fixing," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I just don't know how to stop." "You'll learn," she whispered. "Everything wild teaches you that eventually." Luke watched the stars emerge, the land breathing again after the storm. Somewhere inside him, something unclenched. The ache that had once filled every corner of him had begun to turn into something gentler, something that felt like peace trying to find its shape. By the time spring settled over the plains, the land had softened into green again. The air smelled of mesquite and new beginnings, and Luke found himself standing where the pasture met the horizon, Blaze grazing quietly nearby. The stallion's coat gleamed under the morning light. No trace of the wild fear that once lived behind his eyes. Luke rested a hand against the fence post and breathed in the stillness. It had taken months, but peace, real, hard-earned peace, had come to the ranch. Marisol walked toward him, her boots brushing the grass, her hair loose for once. She carried a saddle blanket folded over one arm. "He's ready," she said simply. Luke nodded, though the words lodged somewhere deep in his chest. They both knew what she meant. Blaze's wounds were long healed. His spirit had returned, untamed but whole. It was time to let him go. They worked in silence. Luke brushed the horse one last time, slow and deliberate, tracing the faint scars beneath his coat. Every motion felt like memory, each stroke a goodbye. He hadn't realized how much of himself had been tied to this creature, how mending the horse had mended him too. When he finished, he reached for the small silver locket that hung beneath his shirt. He held a moment, thumb brushing over Clara's name, then slipped it from a chain and looped it gently around Blaze's neck. "She'd have liked you," he said quietly. Marisol watched, her expression unreadable. "You sure you want to do that?" Luke smiled faintly. Some things belong where they can keep moving. They led Blaze to the edge of the ridge, where the land spilled wide into open country. The sun hung low, gold bleeding into the grass. Luke loosened the reins and stepped back. The horse hesitated, glancing between them, then took a single breath that sounded almost human. And then he ran. The sight was thunder and grace. Hooves pounding, tail streaming, muscles rippling with freedom. Luke watched until the stallion became a dark speck against the horizon and vanished into the shimmer of heat. Marisol stood beside him, hands clasped. "He won't come back," she said softly. "He doesn't need to," Luke answered. His voice carried no sorrow, only calm. He just needed to know he could go. They stayed there long after the dust settled, until the wind began to change direction and the sky folded into evening. When they finally turned toward the house, the world around them felt new again, stripped of its grief and noise. Inside, the lamps cast a gentle glow. The scent of coffee filled the kitchen, mingling with the faint notes of her father's old tune playing from a record in the corner. Luke poured 2 cups and handed one to her. Their fingers brushed, just a touch, brief but certain. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked after a while. "Used to," he said. "Thought maybe if I went far enough, I could outrun what hurt. And now—" He looked toward the window, where the pasture stretched beneath a rising moon. "Now I think some places ask you to stay till you've learned what they're trying to teach." She smiled then, a small, tired smile that carried more warmth than sunlight. Guess we're both slow learners. Outside, the wind moved to the chimes that hung by the porch, the sound light and steady. Luke leaned back in his chair, listening. For the first time in years, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. When he rose, he reached for his hat and opened the door. The night air was cool, alive with the hum of crickets and far-off thunder. Marisol followed, standing beside him on the step. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Somewhere out there, Blaze was running beneath the stars, carrying a piece of the past into the dark. Luke watched the sky a moment longer, then turned to her with a quiet nod. "Let's go home," he said, and together they stepped back inside, the door closing softly behind them like the end of a prayer.